In the fall of 1775, the British and American forces were stuck in a prolonged stalemate around Boston, Massachusetts. Then, a young bookseller with a passion for fortifications and artillery came to General Washington with a bold idea. Join me on Footnoting History as we learn about Henry Knox's ambitious plan to save the fledgling American Revolution. My last letter mentioned that I was just going of Lake George, about 36 miles in length. We had a tedious time of it, although the passage was fine. In coming back, it was exceedingly disagreeable. But all danger and the principal difficulty is now past, and by next Thursday I hope we shall be able to set out from hence on our way home, with our very valuable and precious convoy. If we have the good fortune to have snow, I hope to have the pleasure to see my dearest in 3 weeks from this date. We shall cut no small figure in going through the country with our cannon, mortars, and drawn by 80 yoke oxen. Hello and welcome to Footnoting History. I'm Ted Harvey. By the time Henry Knox wrote this letter to his wife, the American Revolution had been in full swing for almost 8 months. By late 1775, the war remained centered around Boston, with both sides locked in a stalemate. So why was Knox at Lake George with a bunch of cannons in the middle of winter? And what does all this have to do with the American Revolution? Let's take a step back a moment and situate ourselves. On April 18, 1775, British regulars had rode and then marched from Boston to the town of Lexington, where they were met by local militia the following day. The regulars had been sent by General William Gage, commander of the British forces in North America. He was looking for the rebel rousers Samuel Adams and John Hancock, as well as stores of gunpowder and ammunition. After initial engagement at Lexington, the rebels retreated, and the British marched on to Concord. It was here that General Gage had learned that gunpowder and other munitions were being stored. Like his previous attempts to capture these from the colonials during what became known as the powder alarms, Gage had decided to once more send his soldiers. In Concord, the British were met with more substantial resistance. After fighting ensued, the regulars retreated back towards Boston, but the colonial militia, gathering now from across Massachusetts, continued to attack them during the retreat. By the time the British had reached the relative safety of Boston, their casualties had grown to 273, 73 of which were killed. By this point, militia from all the New England colonies had joined with Massachusetts surrounding Boston, and beginning what became known as the Siege of Boston. The rebels formed a siege line from Chelsea to Roxbury, cutting off the only land route to and from Boston across the Boston Neck. A quick side note to our traveling listeners of Footnoting History: if you go to Boston today, much of what was once water around Boston has been built up, so what was Boston Neck in the 1700s is now the South End. So now we have set the scene with the British holed up in Boston, mostly surrounded by thousands of New England militia. But what about Henry Knox and Lake George and those cannons? First, a little background on Knox. Henry Knox was born in 1750. Both his parents were of Scottish background, but had lived in Derry, Ireland before moving to Boston in 1729. Henry's father, William, was a shipbuilder who was constantly down on his luck financially. Little else is known about William Knox, except that he left the family supposedly in search of work. Word came to the Knox family in 1762 that William had died somewhere in the Caribbean. Up until William had left the family, Henry had been enrolled in the prestigious Boston Latin Grammar School. Today the school is still going strong, is one of the oldest grammar schools in the country. At the age of 9, due to his father's departure and the family's need for money, Henry was forced to leave the school and find work. Fortunately, he did so at a bookshop of Wharton and Bowes. Besides providing financial assistance for young Henry and his family, the bookshop was the perfect place for him to continue his education, although in a much less formal manner. He taught himself French and philosophy, but his particular fascination was with military history and engineering science, which would come in handy sooner than he knew. Alongside his books, Knox expanded his education through involvement with local youth gangs and an artillery company called the Train. It was here, under the tutelage of the company's leader, Lieutenant Adino Paddock, that Knox learned the fine art of artillery. He also read copiously about fortifications, engineering, and entrenchments. By 1771, Knox, having done well at the bookshop, opened his own store, the New London Bookstore. The store sold books, stationery, ink, paper, and sealing wax, among other things. The store was a great success and was a gathering spot for all residents of Boston. One frequent visitor, a daughter of a prominent Tory family, was Lucy Flucker. Much to the disappointment of her parents, Lucy fell in love with the gregarious, though poorly born Knox, and the two married in 1774. Lucy was subsequently disowned by her parents, and after 1776 would never see them again. Henry was 24 and Lucy was 18 at the time of their marriage. Both were soon to be tested by war. When they were not together, they wrote numerous letters to each other. These are gathered in a wonderful book, The Revolutionary War Lives and Letters of Lucy and Henry Knox. Make sure to check out the show notes for a full reference. Having married the love of his life, Henry Knox was about to be tested as never before. By 1775, growing tensions between the British and the colonials had finally boiled over into war. Whereas the past confrontations had eventually fizzled out, this time it was not the case. As the New England militias surrounded Boston, Henry and Lucy fled, leaving their shop behind to be tended by Henry's brother William. While well liked by the British, Henry was also a well-known rebel, and staying in Boston would almost certainly have meant imprisonment. Both fled to Worcester, and after making sure Lucy was safe, Henry returned to Boston to join the rebels. Over 13,000 militia had gathered around Boston and were nominally commanded by Artemas Ward. Ward was born in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts in 1721, married Sarah Trowbridge, participated in the French and Indian War, although with limited fighting, returned to Shrewsbury, where he ran a general store and fathered 8 children, and became heavily involved in politics as a vocal opponent to British tax acts. Prior to the outbreak of hostilities in 1775, Ward was named commander of the Massachusetts Colonial Militia. With the influx of other New England militia and the beginning of the Siege of Boston, Ward was named commander of all rebel forces. He immediately took advantage of Knox's engineering skills, putting him in charge of developing the fortifications around Boston. On July 3rd, George Washington, now newly appointed commander of the Continental Army, arrived in Cambridge. Knox met with both Washington and General Charles Lee, and like with General Ward, impressed them both with his engineering knowledge and with the fortifications Knox had developed. Washington in particular took a liking to Knox, and he quickly became one of the handful of men who basically became surrogate sons to Washington. As the summer progressed into the fall, the siege had become a full-blown stalemate, with a handful of very minor engagements. Washington felt growing pressure to attack Boston and tried to drive the British out once and for all. But as was true from the beginning of the siege, without substantial artillery and with dwindling gunpowder, attacking the British would most likely end in devastating defeat. As Washington was to show time and time again throughout the rest of the war, his path to success was in keeping his army alive. As long as the army existed, the revolution could continue. It was at this point in mid-autumn that Knox came to Washington with an idea he believed would change the course of the war in Massachusetts. Back on April 29th, not long after the first shots of the Revolution, a young, ambitious merchant from New Haven, Connecticut, arrived in Cambridge to meet with the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. His name was Benedict Arnold. He informed the committee that there were cannons and ammunition at Fort Ticonderoga, a British fort from the French and Indian War located at the northern end of Lake George in New York State. The committee provided orders that Arnold take a contingent of militia and attack and hold the fort. At the same time, Ethan Allen and his gang of Green Mountain Boys from what would become Vermont had come to the same conclusions as Arnold, that Fort Ticonderoga had some very valuable assets and was ripe for the picking. Arnold, as a newly appointed colonel with 400 men, moved rapidly to secure the fort. Arnold met with Allen, and while no formal documentation exists, it seems that both agreed there would be joint command of the operation. On May 9th, with little opposition, Arnold and Allen took the fort. There were no casualties except for a small injury to one of the rebel attackers. Once taken, the Green Mountain Boys were mostly interested in raiding the liquor. As the supplies began to dwindle, the militia began leaving the fort. Meanwhile, Connecticut sent around 1,000 men to join the fort. But there was still no way to move the cannons and other artillery. For his part, Ethan Allen led the attack on Montreal later that fall, where he was subsequently captured. He would not be released until 1778. He then became a leading advocate for the new state of Vermont. Arnold became one of the Continental Army's most daring generals until he decided he had enough of fighting for the Americans, but that is a story for another day. Now in the fall of 1775, the artillery continued to sit unused at Fort Ticonderoga, and Henry Knox was proposing to go get it. You might think the winter would be the worst time to haul a bunch of cannons at almost 120,000 pounds from New York State across the entire length of Massachusetts. In fact, Knox determined that this would be the ideal time. He could load the cannons onto sleds and pull them over the snow. Washington, who certainly seemed interested in bold options at this point, he had recently sent Benedict Arnold on an expedition to aid in the invasion of Quebec, agreed that Knox's plan was a good one. Knox wasted little time, and accompanied by his 19-year-old brother William, he left the Continental Army and headed first to New York City to determine if there was any available artillery with the army stationed there. Arriving in New York on November 25th, he discovered that a small foundry had been built, which was producing light cannons. Foundries had been outlawed in the colonies, which had put the rebels at a massive disadvantage as they could not build their own artillery. While he was able to secure a handful of newly constructed guns and send them to Washington, it was not enough to break the stalemate in Massachusetts. He left New York 3 days later, heading north along the Hudson River, reaching Fort George on the southern end of Lake George on December 4th. The lake had not yet frozen over, and Knox sailed up the lake to Fort Ticonderoga. There he organized the available artillery, deciding to take 59 pieces. First, the cannons were dragged overland from the fort to the shore of the lake. Then they were painstakingly loaded onto gondolas, scows, and dugout canoes. As the flotilla set sail, Knox sailed ahead separately to make sure the sleds were ready and waiting at Fort George. As Knox continued to wait, he began to grow anxious as there was no sign of the flotilla. He sent a small boat up the lake, where it was discovered that the boat carrying his brother had been damaged and almost sunk. The boat had made it to shore, where it was quickly repaired. By December 16th, all the boats had finally arrived at Fort George. They had made it just as the lake was freezing over. Fortuitously, almost as if Knox had planned it this way, winter finally was setting in, and with it came the much-needed snow. Knox and 300 men had prepared the 55 sleds with oxen and horses, and were ready to proceed south. By Christmas they had crossed the Hudson River, heading towards Albany. Unfortunately, upon reaching Albany there was a thaw and much of the snow began to melt. Without it, there would be no way to drag all the artillery across the land and over the Berkshire Mountains in western Massachusetts. Knox waited anxiously. Fortunately, the thaw only lasted a few days, and by January 7th there was again enough fallen snow that they were able to proceed. The journey was arduous and often slow-going, especially after leaving Albany and crossing the Berkshires. While it became known as the Noble Train of Artillery, which at least in my mind conjures up long, continuous lines of men and cannons, in reality they were broken up into different groups, sometimes miles apart. A particular trying stretch was across 12 miles of woodland in the Berkshires, known as the Greenwoods. Men had to use long ropes tied to sleds, which in turn were anchored to tree trunks so that artillery pieces would not fly down the hills. As Knox himself wrote, it was almost a miracle that people with heavy loads should be able to get up and down such hills as are here. Travel became somewhat easier after they began following an old Native American trail. By bits and pieces, the train of artillery arrived in the town of Westfield, Massachusetts, where they were provided much appreciated food and drink. Having sailed down Lake George, crossed through New York State, and traveled over the Berkshires, the noble train, with Knox at its head, had achieved an amazing trek. Knox now rode on ahead to Cambridge, arriving on January 24th, reported to Washington the good news. While the expedition had ended in success, it was now up to the Continental Army to make good use of the guns Knox and his men had secured. Washington, who was growing more impatient to engage in some type of offensive, was determined to secure Dorchester Heights, which overlooked Boston, and even more importantly, Boston Harbor. Both sides had long known this was the key to holding or losing Boston, but neither side had yet been able to secure the heights. With the arrival of Knox and his cannons, Washington decided it was time for a bold move. First, Washington moved some of the cannons taken from Fort Ticonderoga to high points overlooking Boston in Cambridge and Roxbury. On March 2nd and 3rd, Washington ordered the artillery to open fire. The British responded, but there were no casualties. However, this was just a diversion to Washington's real scheme. On March 4th, the cannons again opened fire. While the British were focused on this bombardment, Washington sent 2,500 men under the command of General John Thomas to the top of Dorchester Heights. They hauled cannons and other artillery and secretly and quietly secured the heights during the night. Washington anticipated that on seeing his forces arrayed above them, the British would be forced to either leave Boston or attack, as they had done so at Bunker Hill months before. He prepared another 3,000 men to be ready to attack Cambridge if the British decided to pick a fight. On the morning of March 5th, General William Howe, the current commander of the British forces in North America, woke to discover what had happened. Immediately, all British cannons were ordered to open fire. Fortunately for the rebels, most shots could not reach the entrenched soldiers, and after 2 hours of constant bombardment, the cannons were silenced. General Howe then ordered an attack on the heights with 2,500 men. 5 regiments prepared to cross the water and attack the well-fortified heights. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, there were delays in loading the troop transports, and then a violent storm descended on the area. It was now that General Howe, perhaps also remembering his attack at Bunker Hill and the carnage from that assault, decided that the writing was on the wall. Boston, and in turn Massachusetts, would have to be abandoned, and hopefully retaken at another time. On March 8th, Washington received a note saying the British would not set the town on fire if the rebels allowed them to sail away unmolested. The British soldiers, along with approximately 1,000 loyalists, sailed on March 17th, heading north to Nova Scotia. Among the loyalists who left Boston were Thomas and Hannah Flucker, the parents of Lucy Flucker Knox. They would never see their daughter again. The departure of the British ended any major presence in New England. Fearing the British would next look to take New York, Washington and his Continental Army headed south on April 4th. Henry Knox went with them as a newly appointed colonel and commander of the artillery. He would continue fighting as Washington's right-hand man and the commander of the artillery for the rest of the war. He was involved in all major actions alongside General Washington. Following the war and the establishment of the United States, Henry Knox became the first Secretary of War, eventually retiring to Maine with Lucy, where he died in 1795. Today you can visit many of the sites made famous by this beginning phase of the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord, as well as the Bunker Hill Monument, of course, but also the Dorchester Heights Monument, erected in the early 20th century. You can also follow the route Knox took to bring the cannons starting from Fort Ticonderoga. Although it seems far less intimidating now to travel this route in your car, a visit in the middle of January might at least give you some perspective of the arduous journey. Between 1926 and 1927, in commemoration of the 150th anniversary, New York and Massachusetts began installation of markers along the route. In all, there were 56 locations that were marked with plaques. The bronze reliefs in New York were designed by Henry James Albright, and the reliefs in Massachusetts were designed by Henry L. Norton. In 1975, the markers between Kinderhook, New York, and Alfred, Massachusetts, were updated as it was determined with new research that Knox did not pass through Claverack, New York. If you want to take a look in the show notes, there are a couple websites with pictures of the markers. While there are many fascinating moments and important events of the American Revolution, the ingenuity and daring of Henry Knox might be seen as a microcosm of the war and the amazing risks the men and women took to achieve their dream. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to head over to footnotinghistory.com for further reading suggestions. We're glad you're here, and it really is true. The best stories are always in the footnotes.